Hello, everyone, and welcome to our opening keynote. Dr. Mark Child has worked in the field of technology-enhanced learning in the UK for 20 years and is now a TEL designer at the Open University, his 10th university. His PhD was awarded in 2010 for his thesis, Learner's Experience of Presence in Virtual Worlds. Mark was the manager of the Theatron 3 project from 2007 to 2009. Which developed 20 ancient theaters in Second Life for performance and learning and has co-written and co-edited 4 books on learning in virtual worlds. He is 4.5 times as old as his avatar. Mark has several points in his presentation where he will want you to contribute to the conversation, so he encourages your thoughts at those points. Please help me give Dr. Mark Childs a warm VWBPE welcome. Dr. Childs, the stage is yours.
Thanks, Letty. Hi, everyone. I thought that before getting into the keynote, I'd share a story with you just to reveal how my second life and my physical life have interconnected. So my avatar name is Gann McGann, because when I joined SL was going through a phase where every surname was that we had to choose from was a list taken from Doctor Who. So with the aliens and characters from the show, and the names of all the actors up to that point. The most recent one of those was Eccleston. So I chose McGann, and then Gann as a first name because I was short on time and a bit of imagination. But then a few years ago I met Paul McGann, and I told him that I named my avatar after him, and then I even showed him my business card to prove it. And the poor guy I think he was a bit unnerved, but he still managed to say, "Welcome to the family," and then shows what a good actor he is, really. But I cringe with embarrassment every time I remember it, and it's actually so embarrassing, it nearly makes my top 5 most embarrassing memories. But to avoid embarrassing myself today, I thought I really felt I couldn't do a 1-hour keynote because I was told it's an hour. So what I've done is I've going to do 3 20-minute presentations. I've built the 3 around a sort of trilogy of books. I've worked on one, and this is the second, and it's on embodiment, identity, and space. So and at this moment there we go, embodiment, identity, and space. Okay, so what I wanted to start, obviously starting with the first of those, this is the one that I haven't made it into book form at the moment. I'm planning on working on it at some point. So I want to look first of all at the ideas of embodiment. Okay, so when I first started researching virtual worlds, I soon came across the idea of presence, but the different types of presence were fairly inconsistently defined. They're defined in different ways in different bits of the literature. But I kind of needed to come up with coherent definitions for myself, and this is what I sort of picked up. So the first one is presence, which is just the idea that you're actually in a virtual space. Social presence, which is your ability to convey who you are in that space. So you have an idea of my social presence because I'm on the stage, but I have less of yours because there's so many of you. But the idea of co-presence as well, so the sense of connection with others within that space. And then finally, embodiment, which is I think the most difficult to get your heads around, is it's the sense of who you are in the virtual world. So embodiment does depend on the sense that you're present in the virtual space, but I think all the others can work independently of each other. In fact, I found a lot of the students I worked with, they experienced co-presence even though some of these other things didn't exist for them. So they felt they were connected to the other people, even though they didn't actually feel like they were in that space in the same way. So, okay, so one project I worked on, I'm just going to run through some of these images for you. Hopefully they'll res okay on your screen. So one project I worked on was to reconstruct different types of theatres. This is the Theatron 3 project that got mentioned. So it takes students on field trips around them. So we see one here. And one of the key things that we see here, the Globe Theatre, and then I'll just final one should res soon. So So sometimes I just wanted to explore these theatres, sometimes to actually do performances on those stages. And one key thing I wanted them to be able to do was, while standing on the stages, well, rather their avatars were standing on their stages, was to feel the same sense of intimidation that I felt. So you could stand on that stage, look at this huge theatre, some of them were the biggest theatres ever made, and then just feel this sense of awe and being small on that stage. I wanted them to experience that. Okay, so I got a mix of responses from those students. None of them, I took around those theatres, felt the same sense of intimidation standing on these stages of these enormous theatres. Most of them, though, found the experience of that virtual world engaging. Oh, I've gone on too many slides there. Let me go back. So what most of these reasons came down to, though, was the students, they said, I just don't get it. For them, they weren't getting anything extra from being in that virtual world that they could have done from pictures looking at pictures in the book. In fact, one of them said that. He says, I've got a book here, I can just look at the pictures. Why do I need to walk around it? So this was key because to the whole experience, the sense that you were there was absolutely fundamental, because I found there was a direct correlation between that experience of embodiment, being there and feeling that you were there, and really having an education experience that they valued and found engaging. And this is taken from a presentation I did with my wife, who's in the audience at the moment. And these were kind of the range of the different sorts of responses we got. So these are the students' responses, but they all came down to this feeling of really not liking it for some particular reason. So I was kind of interested in what was it that meant that some students were getting into it, most students got into it, but some students actually didn't kind of feel like they were getting anything from it. And looking around at the research, I came across this research, which, okay, this is a picture of Carrie Heater. Now, this is from 1992. And what she did was she presented images of subjects of her different people that she was working with. She presented pictures of them on a video screen. And then she asked them to what extent she felt that their on-screen body was their real self. So there you can see yourself on the screen. Does that feel like that is you? And then for about 25%, they just felt completely that on-screen image was them. For about half of them, they felt it was a mixture between them sitting in their seats, feeling their bodies, being there in the physical world, and also split between that and the image on the screen. But for 1 in 4, they felt no connection with their on-screen self. And this is similar to the ratio that I got. Sorry, this isn't in the transcription, but if you could transcribe this bit, please, was that this is that 1 in 4 of my students also felt that they didn't feel this sense of connection. So there was that kind of comparison between the two. So the question is, where does this embodiment come from anyway? And this is I don't know if you know this is the rubber hands illusion. So in the rubber hand illusion, somebody strokes the rubber hand and that's what you can see. But at the same time, they stroke your physical hand, but you can't see that. So bit by bit, the rubber hand starts to feel like it's your hand because you feel that sense of the being touched. What this shows is that your body schema, the way that you map your sense of self, is malleable. And in the same way that the rubber hand can become part of you, your avatar on the screen can become part of you. It's what we call an extended body. In that extended body is similar to this change in your physical sensation. And in the same way, memories of experiences of people playing online games, the memory of the game is stored in the same part of the brain as the memory of the physical world. So those two things are actually able to be mapped one to the other. And if we look at this, next slide, the details of this aren't, well, they're not important, and also I don't understand them, to be honest. But is some research that might explain why this happens. Okay, what you can see in those images is that there's part of the brain that becomes active when people feel embodiment in their avatar. So this is called the left anterior gyrus. I don't know why, what that means, but you know, it's been transcribed for you anyway because I wrote it down. Okay, if people don't experience embodiment within their avatar, it's their right anterior gyrus that becomes activated. So the part of the brain that is linked with this embodiment, this extended body, has actually got a neurological basis for it. And Ganesh and the other people found that this happens in 1 in 4 people. So that 1 in 4 maps to Carrie's research, to my research, and to these people's research, that it's a neurological basis, perhaps, for what we're seeing when we teach. So what does this mean for students, our students, when we're teaching them, if 1 in 4 can't actually experience this sort of sense of embodiment? Okay, well, the mistake I made was making the experience of embodiment an essential part of the learning. In other words, I wanted them to experience that in order for them to feel awe on that stage, and that was part of my learning process for them. And you can't do that. As an aside, this image is a sim by a friend of mine who he built it for the University of Oxford. And what it does is it shows a World War I training camp, and you go through the training camp, and then you follow it by a World War I battlefield. So if you can feel embodiment, if you get to that stage where this becomes some sort of sense of reality for you, it's actually a very powerful experience. But what C-Steph didn't do was he didn't make that an essential part of the learning experience. What he did was he dotted bits of poetry around, and it was really to experience the poetry that he created this. And you can learn stuff from the poetry without being embodied. So that's the bottom line, is make sure there is something in your learning experience for everyone, even those that can't feel embodiment. Okay, another thing you can do is you can talk through their experiences. So you can explain the aims of using virtual worlds. This is something another of my friends did. We can actually turn the difficulties with embodiment into the learning experience itself. So you can foreground those experiences and then start talking through them. And this is an image from a course that was taught at the University of Southern Maine. And it's for counsellors of adolescence. So for many of the students on the course, like me, adolescence was a long time in the past. So you kind of forget a lot of what the real issues are if you're middle-aged. So what my friend did was to help her students empathise, these potential counsellors, with the problems of adolescence. She took them into Second Life because it's awkwardness, the lack of embodiment, the issues with being physical, the norms of what's the right thing to do and what's the wrong thing to do. All of those are kind of like what adolescence feels like when you're in the physical world. And so she basically used some of this lack of embodiment and difficulties with embodiment as a learning experience in itself. So you could flip it in that way. So, and then there's something else we can do, or encourage our students to do. And I'm going back to this image now that we saw earlier. So this is one of the images of the field trip that I took the students on. And this is another one. And what you can see is if you flip between them, there's the same avatar doing the same thing. She's dancing, basically. This is Rosa, and she was dancing around. Everywhere we went, she would dance, and she just couldn't stop dancing. And so I asked her, why did you keep doing this? And what she said was, I like dancing because, I'm quoting now, because we were on the stage. It feels right. So basically what she's saying, that by moving and interacting in this world, in the virtual world, that was giving her a stronger sense of this extended body. She was actually creating more of a sense of this embodiment by doing stuff, by interacting. So, and then that, of course, then went on to help her learn because it's linked. So that would be my final tip is and again, sorry, I didn't put this into my script, so if you could transcribe this bit as well, is if we take our students into the virtual world and then give them activities to do in order to feel this kind of embodiment, to dance, to fly, or to interact, or to play, or all these sorts of things, if we enable them, give them opportunities to feel this body and do things with this body, then we can help further their embodiment. Hopefully you got that bit for the transcription. Thanks. Okay, so that's the kind of first bit, and so over to you. And I mistyped this for you now for discussion. So when you copy and paste my script, there'll be a spelling mistake in this. So I'm interested in how you connect to these experiences. So we can, well, you can ask me questions as well, but also I'd be interested to hear what you say. That to what extent does this relate to your experiences of learning and teaching in Second Life? Have you had students or colleagues who've struggled to feel that sense of connection, and why do you think that is? And also, you know, if you've got any more comments or anything. Okay, I'll just repeat that question for the YouTube feed. So how many of the 1 in 4 could be converted? That's a really good question. I don't know. I mean, the neurological in data would imply that actually you can't convert them. But then nobody knows about these neurological things, whether or not the neurology develops as a result of what you do as your behavior, or whether your behavior is determined to some extent by what your neurological makeup is, or maybe it's a cyclical thing. So maybe I know that one thing is that by lots and lots of experience, most people will develop a greater sense of embodiment. So C-Steph was saying that when he took people into his World War I battlefield, if they'd been in Second Life for a couple of months, then they would get it. They would feel overwhelmed by it. I mean, not as much, of course, as a real thing, but it would be a very strong, guttural emotional experience for them. But if they'd only been doing it for a week or two, they didn't get it in the same way. So I know that it can take several weeks for most people to get to that point. But whether or not everybody would get to that point if you give them enough time, I don't know. And I would guess, I would sense that perhaps they wouldn't. Yeah, Gentle Herons there said other people who do not yet have disabilities can get a sense of what it's like to be disabled when their SL voice does not work or their avatar gets stuck. And in fact, one activity I did, it's not a disability, but it's, well, another thing, a key thing I learned while I work, because I've worked with a few people who have disabilities and then work within Second Life. One of my colleagues, Diane Carr, is part of the deaf community in Second Life. And a big thing she came up with is, and my mentor in this, Ice Guy, is also deaf, and we were talking about this as well, is that a lot of disability isn't actually innate, it's socially constructed. So for instance, if you were deaf and in Second Life, before voice chat came along, it wasn't a problem. But suddenly, now that voice chat is introduced, then it's the way that society is then reconstructed around voice that then creates that disability, as much as the fact that you can't hear in the first place. So what I was doing was I was working, this is when I was at Warwick University, working with somebody there that was talking about social construction of disability. And one of the things she was looking at is pregnancy, in the way that society creates pregnancy as a disability. And so what we were doing was we were making our students pregnant, in that we were getting these attachments that would then be the pregnancy attachment. And I don't know if you've worked with these, but they make demands on you, like you have to eat so many times, and you can't stand for too long. And so you have all of these things coming in at you all the time, telling you that you can't do this now and you have to do this now, and to some extent replicating the experience of pregnancy. And so therefore then her students could go through all these weeks doing it. It's a big commitment. I did it as well. Was for several months. My avatar was pregnant, and he would wander around and then have to excuse himself from meetings because of the demands of his physical body, or his body, these attachments. And so therefore you can then start to see some of that kind of construction. of how the experience of how society constructs a kind of disability. And that's interesting. You can do that with wheelchairs and all these sorts of things within Second Life to kind of create some of those experiences. Right. We're at lots of comments now. Let me see if I have any of these I can get. Maybe if the chair could pick some out for me to respond to, because there's a lot now to catch up on.
Sure. I was looking at some of the comments. Mostly, it's they're talking about the learning curve in Second Life also being a kind of a barrier to embodiment, as well as and I think there was a question in there about the region of the brain. Oh yeah, Edith asked, is that embodiment always located in the same brain region? Others were also comments agreeing with the learning curve as a possible detraction to it. And then there was this long comment, but I'm going to let you answer your question before I get to the next one.
Okay. I'm not a neurologist. I stumbled through that paper from cerebral cortex and only picked up a kind of superficial understanding of it. One thing I do know about neurology is that nothing is ever located in one part of the brain. It's always a complex mix of what these different things. It's extremely malleable, so that if any damage is caused to it, other bits can pick up. This whole left brain, right brain it's only really a metaphor, but it does mean that some things are located some side, some in another place. And so my guess would be that no, it's all over the place, but I'm not really an expert and only really picked up the sort of the vagueness. But it was interesting to me that there was actually a neurological basis for it, but explaining that and locating where that is and where the memories reside, depending on where you've experienced things, that could be anywhere, I guess, or in more than one place.
And then Mook mentioned a very interesting comment about adding the concept of time to embodiment. He says, at the beginning of your talk, you mentioned how the students didn't get it because of the lack of engagement with embodiment. I have found that embodiment also has a direct and important correlation with time. The sense of temporality of a logical continuation and sequence of events and experiences is vital to embodiment and comprehension. Even in a pen and paper game such as Dungeons and Dragons, embodiment and engagement with the game tends to come with time, through setting in with your character and others, with your surroundings and what is happening within those contexts. It's a very interesting concept.
Yeah, and in fact, the whole idea of pen and paper in Dungeons and Dragons is, I think, if we only look at embodiment as happening within virtual worlds as being an issue for virtual worlds, I think it's wider than that, far wider than that. I did some work with students using GoToMeeting, and it's a video conferencing thing, and using different applications online. And there was a very significant change after they'd been meeting in video conferencing. After about a month or two, after about the third or fourth meeting, instead of them all having these separate conversations and basically using it like a telephone, they suddenly switched to representing their ideas and representing themselves within that shared space. And they would get, instead of like saying, look at your map now, and you'd hear the rustle of paper, they would show the map plan, because they were architects. It was an architectural structural engineering. They were building buildings, basically, planning buildings. They would put this plan on the screen, and then they would scribble on it, and they would actually gesture about different rooms and things like that. And in fact, their body, if we could talk about embodiment there, was simply the cursor, or simply the pencil, the virtual pencil on the screen, but it was still representing their physicality in some way, and they were projecting themselves to that space and interacting with each other within that space, because they projected themselves within that that cursor was then their hand, or their interaction with that space. It was there's a great quote from a book, The Social Life of Avatars, a guy called Turner, and he wrote that an avatar locates the body in the, I can't remember, it's something like the practice of the body is located within that space. We are our bodies. Our practice is located in how we interact, and anything within that virtual world that extends that to the space within the world is embodiment. It kind of captures that, but it takes time to feel that sense of connection.
There was only one more question, a request for the source. If you have the source for the study that you mentioned on the brain.
What I should do is I will post that later. So I can easily do that. I'll maybe place that on. Could we update the page within this?
Oh yes, absolutely. Yeah, we can put the source there.
And put the source there. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and I think the rest of them were, I think another one just came in. Are the students who cannot connect to VW the same that have difficulty visualizing things, the ones who do not have a visual learning modality? That's an interesting question.
Yeah, I don't think it connects at all. I think that the only connection I've found, and I would contest this idea of being learning modalities. I think what we find is that your main mode for learning kind of can change over time yourself, and it's not that we have one modality and we stick to it and we're always in that mode. I think we move so much that it's very difficult to pin us down to one particular modality. But the ones that I found were the only link I found to any kind of those modalities were people that were very kinesthetic. No, this isn't true either, because I think it was mainly everybody I noticed that actually struggled among the people that I've worked with. One of them was a sculptor. Another one was a scenographer who actually built scenes with his hands. So it was very physically tactile. Another was a very sports person. These are all people that worked so much with their tactile senses and with their physical connections that when that actual sense of touch was removed, they felt there was too much of an absence. And one colleague I worked with in the Theatron project was actually really distressed by the idea of having to use it, because he needed to hold stuff with his hands and make things that way, and couldn't feel that sense of connection with something that he couldn't touch in that way. Maybe when we get to more haptics, and maybe when we get to VR and those sorts of things, that maybe that next step in that kind of embodiment will work for those too. But at the moment, I think it's the visual people who actually are maybe slightly more advantaged.
I think that was the last question. Well, there was one talking about how some recent studies may have potentially disputed the idea of modalities being so rigid, which is pretty much what you kind of mentioned right now. And then just other people kind of agreeing and making comments on, one person made a comment about embodiment and how it works for blind users. But pretty much that's it. I think that perhaps we should let you continue.
Okay. Now, okay, so I think it might be down to just, I did say 3 20-minute presentations. This might be 2 30-minute ones, but that's okay. So the next one is, the next of my sort of trilogy is identity. And so I wanted to talk about identity, and this is spoken a lot about in a book written by Reinventing Ourselves. And, oh, hang on, sorry, I forgot, I've got a note. I've got a script here. Okay, so I'd like to talk about identity. A lot of this is covered in this book, and I'd have to say that since publishing it, and she's in the audience, that I married my co-editor. So if you get this one, then we get double the royalties, which is kind of cool. So how would I identify identity? I'd identify it as identity as our conceptualization of ourselves. So it's the way we conceive who we are. And I think most of our learners, many of them anyway, would accept that they have multiple identities. So these are different identities depending on who they're with, what they're doing, what their role is. And I think those that see identity in that way can accept that going into Second Life, they form yet another identity because it's yet a different environment. Those that I think see identity as being a rigid, unchanging thing, then struggle with this, with the idea that people within Second Life aren't the same as they are outside of Second Life. Sorry, there's an extra bit there which isn't in the script. One of the things you can do, I think, because forming an identity as a learner within that environment really does support their ability to have social presence. It individualizes their avatar. It enables them to express their personality in some way. And And so therefore it enables the learners to really develop a sense of each other. And so therefore collaborate. I think, sorry, an aside, but I think one of the problems I had with the video conferencing project was that the students didn't really get to a sense in the early stages of who each other were. And I think if learners within this environment just use the basic avatars that aren't individualized, then collaboration is more difficult because things aren't personal in that same way. So what these slides show is activities carried out by summer students at the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago. And what they were doing was they were learning about, well, lots of things, but mainly evolution and paleontology. So the first activity that they were given to do was to redesign their avatars. And that was to respond to the surroundings that they were in. So we have avatars in the rainforest, in a coral reef. The next one, which I can't remember what it is and it hasn't resed yet, so that a tundra, and I think the final one's a desert. So this taught them about how animals adapt to their environments. So that's what they were meaning to. That was the content of what they were doing. But what they also meant was that okay, so that understanding of how natural selection works, but it also helped the students develop their avatar and explore their individuality and create individuality within that space. And then what we found was that after that initial exercise, the learners, once they'd started to change their avatars, they can continue to change them and express their individuality and their difference by continuing to change their avatars. Okay, so the other thing as well is that I think the students and the teachers in their experience, in my experience anyway, quickly divide themselves almost immediately. You have some who consider their identity and think about their identity and like to explore it, and then others that never even think about it at all and just do stuff and never even think about their avatar, never change it, just stick with the first one they've got, and it's not an issue for them. You might have to zoom your cameras in on this because it's quite small, but it's again, I can give you a reference to the original blog. This is another friend and I know a guy I know, Steve Warburton, and he provided for our book that I mentioned, Reinventing Ourselves. And you can see how, and I think somebody's already mentioned this about how things change over time. And what Steve's done here is he's shown how your connection with your avatar changes over time, that you increase your sense of empathy and identity with your avatar. It becomes more of an extension of yourself, but then also you create it. Then after an extension of yourself, you actually develop an independent identity that it can be quite different from your offline identity. And then you may explore multiple identities and create more than one avatar for different purposes within this space. And I can ask you later how many of you have got more than one avatar and what you use the different ones for. So yeah, so for those that don't think about identity, the avatar remains just a point of contact for moving around through the world. And really that locus of movement is just a locus of movement to see what's going on in the world. It's not a projection of them. And to some extent, they don't see everyone else. They assume I think a lot of people then who just use this avatar to move through the space, just assume that's what everybody else is using their avatar for. So you just get I think you then end up with these two quite conflicting viewpoints. One of them just sees Second Life as a game. Their avatar is just a point to move through that space. It's just a toon. I've heard that word used in World of Warcraft as a toon, and they just see this avatar as a toon. But then the other group of people using this space see the virtual world. It's different, but it's still an authentic space, and they are authentic. This is an authentic expression of themselves to some extent. So I wrote a book chapter with another researcher, it's called Michelle Ryan, and she introduced these two terms to describe these two sorts of people. So the pseudo-realists and the synthetic sodalists. The pseudo-realists are those that just see it as all a big pseudo-reality. It's not really real. It's all just fake to them, or it doesn't have that sense of meaning. And And the synthetic sodalists are people who, for whom this is it's another society. It's authentic to some extent for them. And I wouldn't say either is right or wrong. It's not necessarily that you have to be like this or you're unethical. It's just that I think if we take our learners into a learning situation and we make assumptions about what their assumptions are, then we've got a recipe for disaster. We need to make them aware that some people will be responding to it in this way and others will be responding to it in another way. Michelle's worth looking up because she did her PhD is really interesting in that she categorized the different types of learning activity in Second Life. And she's now actually working in TV. She's working on BoJack Horseman, actually. So it's kind of a loss to the educational world because she could have carried on doing this sort of stuff. But then, on the other hand, it does mean that my bacon number is now only 3, which is kind of cool, I suppose. So, okay, so this is some pictures of me and doing different things in Second Life and stuff like that. So I think even those synthetic sodalists, the ones that are creating a new identity for themselves, they can use their identity. There's a whole range of different ways in which identity gets created. So some people will use this space to create a totally fabricated identity. They like identity, they're thinking about it, but they want to create a completely fake one. It's just the way that they want to use this space to kind of feed their imagination to that way. Some people like to represent absolutely accurately their offline identity. They think that they're augmentationists, so they just see the Second Life as being a way to interact, to do that, carry on their real life interactions. So they can. Another way that people use identity is identity tourism. So exploring other identities and the things like disability that we were talking about earlier, or other things. It's like, what would it be like to exist in this way, in a different way within this space? But then also, I think for some people, and I was chatting to somebody at work about this a couple of days ago, it's if your online identity and offline identity are very different, it's not necessarily that you're being fake online. It's about expressing something about your true self. And we wrote about this a lot, this idea of true self, which is some reality about themselves that they can't express in the physical world. So it might be about gender, they might be transgender and not have revealed that to people in the physical world, but then can be the gender they feel they are in Second Life. This is a good example. And I know people that have been through that process of exploring their gender, the way that they experience gender online, and then try and take that offline as well. So I don't want to say that one is the right way to respond to this or one is the wrong way. All of these, I think, are legitimate ways to work with identity within Second Life. But I think as learners and teachers, it's better if we make conscious choices about how we're engaging with identity, and also and also be aware that others are making different choices but are doing that legitimately as well. And here's one exercise that I've done with learners to sort of talk about this sort of thing. And this is to get them to create what I've called identity cubes. So this is based on Karina Gervin's story cubes. They're pretty easy to create. You just have a cube and you just drop 5 images onto them. There's not one on the bottom because obviously that's on the ground. So what I would do is I would talk to them about identity, talk about all these different ideas, and then take the students to a space where they build these cubes, and on those images, each side, it represents 5 different aspects of their identity. And it can be online identity, it can be offline identity. So both of those together. So then what the students do is they walk around, or their avatars walk around the space, but they might have blurred into one by that stage anyway. And so the student stands next to their identity cube and they talk to their other students about what each image means to them. So it says what it says about them as a person, where that originates, and then it kind of leads to a conversation about the origins of identity, and then how we present or represent identity to each other. I want to just, as another aside, I kind of want to talk a bit about the methodology that I've used in analysing these kind of environments. So if you're not interested in methodologies, you could just tune out for a minute or two. But so what I started using was something called activity theory, which you might be familiar with. And it's basically, it's not a theory, really. It's just a kind of way to take a whole mass of what is can be a very confusing process of lots of things going on, and chunk it into different activities. And we can see that it's rules and conventions, community, division of labour, and then the subject is who's doing it, the object it's what they're doing it on, and then we have tools and instruments is what they're using to interact with. So basically, it's self-evident. But I think when we're talking at virtual worlds, and I think maybe anything else, I've found that this process of identity, who the learner is, and who you are as teacher, and also the sense of presence that I was talking about earlier, they both need to be included in anything that we're doing, an analysis of that. So I think if you are using activity theory to analyse, evaluate learning within this environment, those are also things that need to be considered, and I would suggest adding them to your activity theory model. And what I've done is I took the plane of the triangle of activity theory, added identity and presence above and below, and then if you move it around a bit, it actually comes out as a cube, which is kind of neat. So those are the two things I think that's my plea for that bit. Is identity is a big issue, and it's a big source of conflict for our students or for anybody who's actually moving around in a virtual world. And I think the key thing there is to make the learners aware that not everyone engages with identity in the same way. It might be just fake for some, for others it's another part of their lives. For others, it's actually exploring a part of their life that really matters to them and they can't do offline. So I think the only way we can do that is foreground it. We need to take our students through that process of considering how learners' development of identity and embodiment evolves, and then how that will have an impact on how their learning works. Okay, so I've got 30. We're not going to get into part 3, but let's have a good chat about this. So I'd be really interested to see how do you think identity has an impact on your interaction with the virtual worlds or that of your students, and is there anything else that you'd like to come back on about anything that I've said about that?
There were some interesting comments as you were speaking that kind of respond to that question. Some people were talking about their own personal experiences with identity. Like some say that they do take on different roles, like as a tiny, an elf, other fantasy character, or human. And then another person who says she couldn't be able to keep track of more than one. But there were, which I completely understand. And then there were a couple of questions on the issue of empathy, and actually both of them I feel were similar. One person asked, did these experiences develop empathy in students? And then another one asked, does that help students develop their ability to take other viewpoints, which I feel are somewhat related? I
think we're getting back to this idea of presence and embodiment again, though, in that maybe not. I mean, I think somebody was saying, can we convert the 1 in 4? And I think there maybe is a process whereby even if the students don't feel it's an authentic experience, if they are actually engaging with it and are motivated to learn from the environment, then we can still ask them to engage and pretend that it's important to them, or do role play and those sorts of things. There's some really interesting, again, I'll make a note of this and put a reference to it, but it's things like experiencing racism online. There was, I think there was a study done between Chamorro, Filipino, and Caucasian students, and also avatars, and they gave them all a Caucasian student, and then they gave them all a Chamorro student avatar, and then they asked them to talk about those experiences. So I think actually making somebody go into that world, and to some extent, obviously you're never going to replicate the day-to-day experiences of sexism, racism, all the other isms that there are in life. But I mean, even to just give people a taste, or even just give them a trigger point in order to explore that in a conversation, I think can be valuable. So I don't know necessarily whether, yes, so I think what I'm trying to say is that, yes, maybe to some extent, some people can feel that if you put them in that environment and give them a different skin, or, experience anti-furry prejudice or something. But then also, I think that there's one of my favorite quotes about gaming is that a game is, this isn't a game, I know, but the learning experience that you can do isn't necessarily just beginning and ending within the Second Life, in that actually what you can do is you can take people into this environment, show them these different experiences, and then have a conversation about those, and that conversation about what you can and cannot experience, what those different things are, that's maybe where some of that empathy can come out, because you're talking about those things with other people. I don't necessarily think automatically that empathy will occur simply by putting somebody within that space and then getting them to feel all this stuff, but it could be a good trigger for a kind of very positive discussion afterwards with people that can really express their different opinions.
There was also another kind of related question on that issue of identity and multiple identities, and somebody asked that perhaps isn't this the utility of having parallel worlds for different or enhanced functions, like if you do different things, different purposes?
Yes, and I think well, I mean, there's so many different spaces within Second Life. There are business spaces, and there are nightclubs, and I mean, that's perhaps enough of a space in order to have one identity for doing your work stuff, and then kicking off and going somewhere else to sort of relax afterwards. I think, yes, maybe different platforms, but I think one of the biggest issues we have, somebody talked about the amount of time it takes to get our students into Second Life and interacting, functioning competently within the space, and that is an enormous overhead. It can take hours sometimes. So having another platform that for something else and another platform for yet a third thing just adds to that burden of just becoming accomplished at different things. So I'm definitely think about bounded spaces within this environment for doing those different sorts of activities, and then having maybe one identity for one space and another identity for another space, and maybe different platforms, but maybe just having enough different kinds of spaces within one platform is maybe the most efficient way to deal with that.
And I think we're caught up with chat. One question just popped up, so we're up to date. Is it easier for students to assume a role than to create an identity?
Oh, that's a good question. Is it? I see. Creating an identity kind of. It depends what we mean by create an identity. I think remember all those. I kind of listed them all really quite quickly. Hopefully the script caught it, the transcript caught it, of the different ways that identity means different things for different people. So if I was going to create an identity, I would just be me, but maybe a bit more outward going, and develop that. And I think that would develop over time to some extent. And of course, our identities also are influenced by the community with which we interact, about what our role is within that space, our status, and all those different sorts of things. So I think creating an identity is quite an easy thing to do if you were just doing what comes naturally and just moving around and buying and shopping and all that sort of stuff, because shopping is a great way to help build an identity. I don't think, therefore, it's that we would necessarily attribute effort to creating identity, but it just takes time because to create an authentic one, because it requires all those interactions. Creating a role, I found most of my students, except for the drama ones, I've kind of worked with people from a lot of different disciplines. Drama students don't have a problem with role play. Everybody else does. I've worked with disaster management students who had to adopt the role of working in disaster areas and working with different agencies that responded to that disaster. And Second Life worked better than the physical world because it was easier for them to lose the physical connections with each other, and so therefore they, in the physical version of the activity, they had to adopt a role and then be these agencies, and it was very difficult because they're pretending to be somebody they're not in the physical world. It was easier to pretend to be somebody they're not in the virtual world, but not that easy. It still is a very difficult thing for a lot of people. And I struggle with role play within the role play environments. I will do it and I will create that, what G calls a projective identity. So a version of my identity that will function as a, you know, a member of cast of Star Wars, or a member, or a you know, kind of a dragon or whatever. So it's a version of me, but then role playing as a dragon, role playing as something from Star Wars, would be easier for me than anything else, but it's still enormously difficult, and I think other people would find that as well.
And I know that there was somebody who made a comment about that issue, bringing students into Second Life, that you basically had to have a person, the teacher, and then a non-teacher basically focusing on getting students acclimated to the environment so that the teacher could focus on teaching. There were also a couple of other questions related to education as well. You know, Edith asked the big question, you know, why use it in education? And then somebody asked a follow-up. Does identifying with your avatar aid learning or interfere with it?
I think it depends. One of the things is I don't think we can make a sort of blanket statement about all forms of learning as requiring the same sort of thing. I mean, for instance, one of the things that I've seen, I mean, there are things that you can do in Second Life that you cannot do as effectively anywhere else. I think that's been demonstrated time and time again over the last 10 years. So the only question is, do the costs financial costs, but also the time costs and the cognitive load costs of being within the environment justify the extra justify the extra benefits? But there are indisputably benefits of being in here. And it's a very straightforward one. Is I'm working at the moment at the Open University with people that are doing, for social workers, home visits. So they don't want to have to send their students out to a home visit, which in a very risky area, perhaps the first time, without them being able to understanding about some of the basics and risk assessment and those sort of things. So it's a safe environment in which to wander around and look at, is this a risky environment? Should I get out of here? Now, you don't need an identity with your avatar in order to do that. You just need to be able to walk around the space and spot that, you know, here's this is a health hazard, or this is a hygiene hazard, or whatever. But there are other things we're doing, particularly like when we're actually exploring sociological aspects of Second Life, the sort of the thing about feeling embodied so that you can then explore racism or disability, prejudice and those sorts of things. Then I think in those situations, identity is key, because if you're wandering around and you identify and empathize completely with your avatar, and it gets discriminated against or abused, you will actually feel to some extent the emotions, that affinity connection that we want our students to feel in order for them to then go on and learn the things we need to learn. So it's completely, it really does depend completely on what sort of thing we want our learners to learn in that space.
Thank you so much, Mark, for such eloquent responses to our questions and our comments. We had a couple more comments, but I think we need to wrap up. Everyone, please give Mark a hearty applause for such a wonderful presentation. Mark, thank you so much for gracing us with your presence. This was a very interesting discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, so if you can just send me a reminder, I'll try and remember all the references that I said I would source for people. And if I've forgotten anybody, then just email me and I'll make sure I can track those down for you.
Okay, I'll send you a reminder. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Okay, bye then.